Well, friends, I just want to take a moment to congratulate the former president of the United States, Donald Trump, for a new high score. Woo! Looks like we're gonna go for three indictments. Three indictments, two impeachments, legally liable for essay. I mean, if racking up legal trouble as a former president were some sort of a game, he would without a doubt be the winner. Now, listen, you may get the sense that Trump doesn't pose as big of a threat in 2024 because of all of the legal trouble that he's in. But to the contrary, I just don't think that that's true. It would be true if we lived in a sane world. The problem is that we don't live in a sane world. He is still the GOP's 2024 frontrunner despite being indicted twice, and as ABC News reports, he was just notified by special counsel Jack Smith that he is the target of another probe, which means a third indictment could be imminent. And I don't think any of us expect this to change his status as GOP frontrunner. Now, he acknowledged the latest probe on Truth Social, predictably calling it a witch hunt and saying this is tantamount to election interference and the weaponization of law enforcement. Now, normally you would just ignore Trump when he says things like this, right? But the difference from his previous diatribes on social media and this one is that the things that he's saying now, because he is not just a presidential contender, but the front runner for the GOP, it has very specific policy implications, and what he's saying is dangerous. So the subtext of what he's saying there is that since Biden is able to interfere in the election by weaponizing law enforcement to go after his political opponents, well, maybe he should be able to do the same thing if he's elected president again. In fact, this isn't just speculation because he explicitly said this after his second indictment.
I will appoint a real special prosecutor to go after the most corrupt president in the history of the United States of America, Joe Biden, and the entire Biden crime family. Name a special prosecutor. And all others involved with the destruction of our elections, our borders, and our country itself. They're destroying our country.
So in other words, I'm going to do what I'm accusing the Biden administration of doing, which I said is bad. I will weaponize the Justice Department to go after my political opponents. Now, don't you think that if he actually believed that what Biden was supposedly doing were bad, that he would instead call for reforms to enhance accountability and transparency and the autonomy of the Justice Department, and not just pledge to conduct himself in the same exact way which he deemed as corrupt? Doesn't that seem a little bit weird? No, instead he's broadcasting his intent to do bad things with the excuse being that Democrats did it, so I can too. Now, the thing is that these investigations are not political witch hunts. And if Biden had complete control over the Justice Department, don't you think that he wouldn't allow them to investigate him for his handling of classified materials and his financial ties with Hunter Biden? Don't you think that Biden would just shut that down unilaterally? See, the reason why a president could seemingly be investigated by his own Justice Department in the first place is because it is an independent agency. But Trump has signaled that he'd bring an end to the Justice Department's autonomy. How? Well, simply by appointing someone like Jeffrey Clark to the Justice Department if he's elected. Now, for those of you who don't remember, Jeffrey Clark is somebody who Trump tried to name as his attorney general back in 2020 in an effort to help him steal the 2020 election. But Trump backed down after the Justice Department employees threatened him with mass resignations. But if Trump wins in 2024, here's what that means for Clark and the Justice Department in general. As the New York Times explains, Mr. Clark, who was a favorite of Mr. Trump's and is likely to be in contention for a senior Justice Department position if Mr. Trump wins re-election in 2024, wrote a constitutional analysis titled, "The U.S. Justice Department is not independent," that will most likely serve as a blueprint for a second Trump administration. Like other conservatives, Mr. Clark adheres to the so-called unitary executive theory, which holds that the President of the United States has the power to directly control the entire federal bureaucracy, and Congress cannot fracture that control by giving some officials independent decision-making authority. So this is why what Trump is saying here is more important than his usual diatribe. He could potentially consolidate power and actually weaponize the Justice Department to go after his political opponents. And when people like myself push back, they'll cry hypocrisy or accuse you of selective outrage for not condemning Biden for doing the same, even though Biden did not do that. But to average voters, that argument seems compelling on its face. And that's an issue because it gives Trump the legitimacy that he needs for that type of a power grab. But Trump's ambitions for executive power extends even beyond that, because as the New York Times explains, Mr. Trump and his associates have a broader goal: to alter the balance of power by increasing the president's authority over every part of the federal government that now operates by either law or tradition with any measure of independence from political interference by the White House, according to a review of his campaign policy proposals and interviews with people close to him. Mr. Trump intends to bring independent agencies like the Federal Communications Commission, which makes and enforces rules for television and internet companies, and the Federal Trade Commission, which enforces various antitrust and other consumer protection rules against businesses, under direct presidential control. He wants to revive the practice of impounding funds, refusing to spend money Congress has appropriated for programs a president doesn't like, a tactic that lawmakers banned under President Richard Nixon. He intends to strip employment protections from tens of thousands of career civil servants, making it easier to replace them if they are deemed obstacles to his agenda, and he plans to scour the intelligence agencies, the State Department, and the defense bureaucracies to remove officials he has vilified as the sick political class that hates our country. Quote, the president's plan should be to fundamentally reorient the federal government in a way that hasn't been done since FDR's New Deal, said John McEntee, a former White House personnel chief who began Mr. Trump's systematic attempt to sweep out officials deemed to be disloyal in 2020 and who is now involved in mapping out the new approach. Quote, what we're trying to do is identify pockets of independence and seize them, said Russell T. Vought, who ran the Office of Management and Budget in the Trump White House and now runs a policy organization, the Center for Renewing America. So their goal is a complete paradigm shift to fundamentally reshape government and expand the power of the presidency, thus upsetting the balance of power and further eroding the principles of democratic governance. And that is horrifying because they're just admitting that they're going to do this, right? And Republican primary voters, they just don't seem to care. Maybe they don't know, but if they did know, odds are they probably wouldn't care. Trump is the front runner by far. And once you open the door to this idea that the president has absolute power, absolutely, then really anything becomes permissible. Anything is possible. He even joked about packing the Supreme Court.
You know, many presidents never get the opportunity to appoint a Supreme Court justice. I had 3. They are going. They are not happy about that. And maybe we'll get 3 or 4 more. Can you imagine? Let's get 7. Let's have 7 or 8 or maybe even 9.
Now, to be fair, there's nothing in the Constitution preventing him from doing this. In fact, it's a move that I and others encouraged Biden to make in order to rebalance the court after Republicans stole 2 seats. But Trump's justification here is that we should do it to trigger the libs, whereas the justification from the left is that we should do it to address the court's legitimacy crisis, corruption, and enhance democracy so the court better represents the American people. There's a real meaningful difference there between those 2 justifications. But that clip gives us some additional insight into Trump's governing philosophy, to the extent that he has one, right? I don't think that he has a cohesive view of how government should work or who it should work for. But to him, he thinks that it's not really about the people. It's not about serving the people who elected him. He doesn't want to be a public servant. He wants power so government can better serve him. And his thirst for power is only going to grow because it's not just about his ego and narcissism any longer. This is about him getting elected again so he could save his ass from serving any prison time, because that executive immunity is definitely going to come in handy if the legal issues continue to pile up. And that is why I say that as his legal troubles become worse, he's going to become more dangerous, right? As the indictments pile up, his thirst for power is only going to deepen. And that alone is dangerous. But what makes matters even worse is the fact that the Republican Party, they enable him. For example, look at how Marjorie Greene reacted to his indictment, and don't miss the Freudian slip at the end.
You're talking specifically about his conversations with officials in Georgia?
I'm talking specifically on every single level. He can ask, was there election fraud? I should be able to ask if there's election fraud.
But can he ask them to find a specific amount of votes?
That's not what I'm talking about. I'm saying there's nothing wrong with asking for election fraud. And yeah, he can say, hey, where are these votes?
First of all, he didn't ask where the missing votes were. He straight up told Georgia's Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, to find him the votes, meaning cheat. And you've got to love how she said at the end there's nothing wrong with asking for election fraud, because even if she didn't intend to say that vocally, right, we all know that that's how she feels within her heart. But you could argue that Marjorie Greene's opinion doesn't really matter because she's just one Republican politician and nobody really takes her seriously. And I'll grant you that point. But here's what the Speaker of the House and leader of the Republican Party said in response to a potential third Trump indictment.
Well, I guess under a Biden administration, Biden America, you'd expect this. If you notice recently, President Trump went up in the polls and was actually surpassing President Biden for re-election. So what do they do now? Weaponize government to go after their number one opponent. It's time and time again. I think the American public is tired of this. They want to see equal justice, and the idea that they utilize this to go after those who politically disagree with them is wrong.
And that right there is why I find this moment so dangerous. It's not just Trump who's saying these things. Republicans with real power are parroting the dangerous things that he's saying. And it's not like this is a new phenomenon, right? But I think that as time goes on, as Trump gets more desperate, the threat increases. And once you kind of accept this idea that Biden weaponized the Justice Department against his political opponents, which again is not true, but if Republicans believe it, then you kind of have to allow Trump to do the same thing if he's in power again. Otherwise, you're just the useful idiot for liberals. Republican voters are never going to allow you to get away with it if you condemn Trump because, well, Biden did the same thing, right? So in conclusion, even if Trump's attempt to move us closer towards authoritarianism ultimately fails, the problem is that he has already legitimized the prospect of authoritarianism. He has gotten GOP voters to think about the end of democracy and us having a dictator, and many of them are comfortable with that, so long as he's the dictator, right? And that in and of itself is bad for democracy. So this crucial moment in America's history is something that I don't want people to take for granted, right? Our government, it might be too dysfunctional to materially deliver anything for the American people or save us from climate catastrophe. But here's the thing. If we lose what's left of democracy, then the small chance we have of making any difference disappears entirely. And I would rather have a small chance to make a difference and save the planet than have no chance, because the stakes are very high right now. And even if it is a 0.5% chance, if democracy is so dysfunctional that that's all it affords us in terms of change as people, I'll take that over 0%. And it's sad, but that's where we're at, unfortunately, and I think that we need to be realistic about the situation that we're currently in.
Penis and balls.
Vagina.
Penis and balls.
Vagina.
P-word and balls.
Vagina.
P-word and balls.
Vagina.
Ass.
Come.
Ass.
Come.
Ass.
Come.
Vagina.
She stroked my face with the
Vagina.
She stroked my
Penis and balls.